Okay, so today we will talk about planning, more like urban planning. We'll talk a lot about parks and landscape design planning, mostly in the 19th century, especially the mid to late 19th century. And we've talked a little bit about this so far. We talked a little bit about like Renaissance garden design. We definitely talked about some urban planning in the Baroque period with like the plan for Rome with those boulevards that radiated out from the Piazza di Popolo. And of course, that was influential to Christopher Wren's design after the London fire, which was also, the in Versailles and the basis for Washington, D.C. even. We even mentioned briefly a little bit the plan for Savannah, Georgia, which was more of a grid plan, and the idea that with this blank slate that existed in the New World, that planners and city builders could kind of create a new form of city. So we'll talk a little bit about some of that, but really also what did Europeans wind up doing with their old cities, especially with the major plan for Paris that we'll discuss here. But I want to start with Hyde Park. This is in London, and this dates from the 1820s. We talked about Decimus Burton before. He was a landscape designer largely, and I think was even working building greenhouses with the early cast iron architecture that we had talked about. But he was brought on in the 1820s to design what is now known as Hyde Park. And that's this area right here in central London, a very large area, and it traditionally had been a hunting ground for the English monarchy. And there were some buildings and palaces actually at the west end. Kensington Palace is way over here on the far west end of Hyde Park, and it's still there today. In fact, Lady Diana actually lived there after her divorce from Prince Charles, and other royal family members actually lived there as well. But as we got into the 19th century, this hunting grounds was converted into essentially a large public park. And Decimus Burton's challenge was, okay, how do we make this area more accessible for the public? I should also note that in 1851, the big exhibition that included the Crystal Palace that we had talked about, again, a major industrial revolution cast iron structure, was also housed on Hyde Park, and then some of that landscape was redeveloped after the fair was over. And what I also like about this map here is you can see just the density of the city of London, and what a major space this is. I mean, even today it's quite large in the city. This little area just to the right of Hyde Park, this little big sort of cream area, this is where Buckingham Palace is located, if you're at all familiar with London. And of course, you've seen video or photos, I'm sure, of Buckingham Palace. So here's an aerial view of Hyde Park as it exists today, and again, you can really see the cityscape all around it. As we'll be talking about it momentarily with New York Central Park, you've probably seen the aerial views of that, and it's somewhat similar in that you have this large rectangular green space surrounded by the dense city. This just doesn't have the skyscrapers that New York has. But what I want to, what's really nice in seeing this aerial view is the two concepts that were happening here. One is a trend that we had talked a little bit about with 19th century English architecture, and that was a trend towards sort of the picturesque, the idea of creating less of a structured, human-formed gardens that we saw in the Renaissance, that everything was very symmetrical and rigid and regular with, geometric gardenscapes laid out, to something that felt more like a naturalistic landscape. And you see this very large body of water here that just kind of meanders and flows as if it's a natural lake. This is all created by Burton and the construction to create this park. There was probably a stream running through here that they could dam up and create a lake, but the lake itself didn't actually exist. But the intention here was to make it look like, you know, God had created it or nature had created it. And there's, you know, large areas of just naturalistic landscape of trees and meandering paths. But you can also see, if you look a little bit towards the left, where my pointer is, you can see more of a straight line that slices through. This is more of a boulevard-like allée. And over in the far upper left is a more regular reflecting pool or pond that has a more geometric form, and that's more, you know, human created. That's, you know, obvious that somebody created this, you know, formal pool. And so this is a bit of a contrast. It's sort of a combination of picturesque, naturalistic, and you know, some of these slices of boulevards and allées that go through it. So here's a view of that lake that we saw, and you can see that it has little inlets and coves. The trees come right up to the edge, and it looks as though you, if you're wandering through the park, you would stumble upon this just as you would stumble upon some pond or lake in, you know, in a natural park. Across the lake is a roadway, and so they built a bridge. This is a stone bridge, but not the cast iron that we'd been talking about, partly probably to make it look a little more, you know, sophisticated and not just industrial looking. But this allows both pedestrians to cross the pond, but it also allows traffic to cross the pond, because now we're in an era of city where, you know, traffic flow is becoming more and more important. Even though this is, you know, in the 1820s, we're still talking about horse and buggies, but it's still, you know, transportation and traffic networks are becoming more and more critical that we see here. We also see a little bit, there's a little garden or walk path that goes along the edge of the pond, and you see a little vault here on the left and on the right into the bridge, where pedestrians, you know, can cross under the bridge as they meander along the lake shore. But scattered throughout are more human interventions. This is the Wellington Arch, celebrating the great victory by Wellington over Napoleon in the, you know, 1812 or whatever at Waterloo, and this is, you know, added in 1828, and, you know, it's a triumphal arch. It's sort of based on the Roman triumphal arch there, so it's kind of neoclassical in that sense, similar to the 18th century neoclassical architecture that we've been talking about. But it's, you know, that's part of that connection between a naturalistic landscape and a human formed landscape with, you know, a very, you know, neoclassical architectural element added in. This is a painting by one of the great impressionists, Pissarro, and this shows one of the allées, or what the French called allées, not to be confused with, you know, the alley in the back of your house, you know, where the garbage and you know, garages. These were, you know, typically straight boulevards meant for either walking and or, you know, carriages, and the population would take a little, you know, walk in the afternoons or early evenings. It was kind of a social thing. You would see and be seen in your top hat and your fancy dress, and, you know, you would either stroll hand in hand with your you know, spouse or your lover, or you would, you know, ride in a carriage and, you know, wave at people as you walked by. And there would be typically lined with benches and so forth. But this would be, you know, representative of the kind of human, you know, planning element, and typically lined with trees to create this very strong visual axial line. So probably one of the most significant planning projects that occurred in the 19th century is the Boulevard system of Paris. This starts in 1853. It lasts for a couple of decades almost, and the major elements are largely completed by 1870. This is undertaken under the supervision of Georges Eugene Haussman, also known as Baron Haussman. Here is an image of Baron Haussman here in the fancy jacket, talking about his plans with Emperor Napoleon III over here on the left. Not to be confused with the Napoleon, that was number one. The French Revolution sort of faltered, got pretty bloody and violent. Napoleon took over basically as a dictator, but when he was deposed, there was some back and forth, but he had some relatives that essentially had a almost monarchical system through much of the early to mid 19th century before we had a couple more violent outbreaks that finally a more permanent republic in France. So, and this is key, historically speaking, because Napoleon III at this time had a strong enough control over the government and over the city of Paris to be able to implement this. If we go back, remember when we talked about Christopher Wren's plan for London after the fire, that was never implemented, those, slicing boulevards and creating a better traffic flow system to get rid of the meandering medieval streets. That was never implemented because really the English monarchy wasn't strong enough to simply condemn property and force people off of their land and so forth. But Napoleon III, using or working with Baron Haussman, who essentially ran this project, had that authority and was able to do that. It wasn't without controversy in Paris. Not everybody liked this and thought that the city was being ruined, but of course the city of Paris as we know it today is the impression we all have is this work that got done in these in the mid 19th century. So, by 1850, here's a rendering view, kind of a bird's eye type view of Paris. The city was, still a medieval city. It was very compact. It was very dense, overcrowded. There were still city walls that were sort of constraining growth that was rapidly happening, especially with the Industrial Revolution. More and more people were moving to urban cities to work in factories and businesses, and the cities weren't growing fast enough to accommodate that influx. There wasn't a very good sewage system, which caused a lot of outbreaks of diseases, especially cholera. And you have buildings that are constantly in need of maintenance and so forth. So there were a lot of problems, and part of this project that Baron Haussman oversaw was meant to alleviate and remedy a number of these urban problems, and in fact they did. If you create boulevards and rebuild new streets, you can also put in the infrastructure of sewers and water lines and that sort of thing at the same time. So here is a plan of the city, and you can see that in the sort of pink color is the medieval boundaries of the city. It grows, by in the 1850s in this kind of yellow or mustard color element beyond that, and a significant amount of territory gets expanded beyond that. And this also begins to a little bit of the boulevards that are added into the city, but let me go to the next plan here, which I think shows that a little bit better. So, like almost all medieval cities that had just grown up ad hoc over time, it was full of meandering streets. There were no such things as straight lines and city grids and so forth, like you think of with Chicago. And so it was very difficult to traverse around the city. And as we started seeing more and more traffic from carriages and buggies, and of course, ultimately automobiles, the meandering streets become a major traffic impediment. that wasn't quite as bad in medieval times when people just walked around, but it was more and more a serious issue. And so these colored lines, and we start with the red ones, which were the initial ones started in the 1850s, were meant to connect major locations, major places in the city of Paris, similar to what the Rome plan had been, which was meant to connect, major pilgrimage sites, or the plan for London, which connected, major elements, of course, never implemented, and of course in Washington D.C., which was built from scratch, the Capitol building, the President's House, certain parks and monuments and so forth were connected with these straight boulevards. And so that same thing gets done here in Paris. Not all of them are perfectly straight. You can see a few sort of slightly curving lines. Some of them are quite long, some of them were shorter. But the idea is that this would provide visual connections between great monuments, but also transportation links that made it easier to traverse around and through the city. And on the far left is the Moda Bologne, which was similar to Hyde Park. It was an old hunting grounds for the French monarchy. It had been sort of left undeveloped, and this was converted, like Hyde Park, into a public park. So if we look at a modern Google aerial map, of Paris, this is on the right bank. On the far upper left corner is the Arc de Triomphe, and this is the Champs-Élysées, slicing down from upper left to lower right down to the Tuileries Garden, which was the sort of formal gardens for the Louvre Palace. Right adjacent to the Tuileries Garden at the lower right corner is a new plaza called the Place de la Concorde, and there's a smaller place, located halfway down the Champs-Élysées, and you can see from these different the Arc de Triomphe and this place right here are almost, it's like the hub of a wheel with spokes radiating out straight to other hubs. There's one down at near the lower left, actually lower left and sort of center left, that also create hubs for spokes of wheels that extend out. And even slightly curved, as we see on the left side, still provides a relatively straight, more easily traversed street. You're not constantly making twists and turns, getting lost, having, to deal with turning radius of carriages and so forth. So this creates a city that visually links all these great monuments, some of which get built later, but it also, links different neighborhoods of the city together. And this is a photo I took in 2009 when I was there. This is at the Tuileries Garden. The obelisk, that's an Egyptian obelisk that was brought in, I think, probably by Napoleon when he invaded and conquered Egypt a few decades earlier. That's at the Place de la Concorde, and you can see the Arc de Triomphe all the way at the back end. That's, a mile or two away. Actually, it's probably several miles. It looks, but it's so massive, it looks rather big, but it's a long distance from the Tuileries Garden to the Arc de Triomphe, and it's a straight line, very wide boulevard. It has, major traffic in the center. It has pedestrian walkways with trees lining it. It has parking lanes all along there. So I like this photo because you can really get a sense of what a visual connection, but also transportation-wise, how it can link together major parts of the city. And if you compare that to the Latin Quarter, the famous left bank Latin Quarter of Paris, where the Sorbonne University still is, which was largely not rebuilt by Haussman. This is still more the medieval character of Paris. You can see very narrow streets. It's only wide enough for people to walk. So if you tried to have carriages or horses going through, you could easily get trampled, and it would clog things up. And of course, there's really no way you could have a car driving down this anymore. At best, you can have a delivery, vehicle come through at times, but it's really a pedestrian quarter because that's how narrow these streets are. And I have a few images showing historic images as they were starting this process and views that compare it to today. So on the top is a historic view. You can see they've started a boulevard, and it ends and it gets really narrow, and you can see lots and lots of buildings. But that same view now is of a perfectly straight boulevard lined with buildings, and it makes for more efficient traffic flow, and it opens things up to create a better visual vista. And here's an aerial view of a boulevard that you can see lined with buildings along here. Most of these, most of the buildings that we see throughout Paris that are lining these boulevards are built in the mid to late 19th century as they're building these boulevards. And so the Paris that we see is very homogeneous in the sense that it's all built within several decades of each other. So the architectural styles are similar. They usually call it Second Empire style because this is the Second Empire, French Empire under Napoleon III. And, you've got the mansard roofs, the gray slate or the gray lead-coated copper, and that's our image, right, of the city of Paris today, of these grand boulevards and these, stone buildings with iron balconies and mansard roofs, because they're all built within this, several decade period. Here's another historic view. This is taken from the roof of the Opera building, now known as the Opera Garnier, and there's a plaza built outside of it. And you can see, two symmetrical buildings that flank what appears to be a boulevard that goes one block. Well, that boulevard, later gets extended all the way, slices all the way straight on down, all the way through, this image here. So, it does take them several decades to do this, but over time they condemn the buildings, they tear them down, they put in the boulevard, and they build these new buildings. And you can, again, imagine the amount of disruption that causes to people living there, to people's businesses, and so forth. So it took a lot of government intervention to do this, and it was very disruptive for these decades that it's done. But nowadays we think, wow, Paris is, can't hardly imagine it as anything different. So here is another Pissarro painting. This is taken almost the opposite view. The Opera Garnier is off here in the far distance, and now you can see it's half a mile or so or more of boulevard lined with these Second Empire French buildings. And lastly, the Moda Bologne, and similar to much of what we saw with Hyde Park, this was reworked to create a more naturalistic environment. So this was kind of the picturesque natural relief to the very structured human intervention of the urban city itself. And we start to see that more and more in urban planning, where the city is very axial and symmetrical with straight boulevards or grids of streets, but then parks are created that provide a more naturalistic setting where people can, immerse themselves as if they're in, the middle of nowhere, in a natural park or something like that, or a natural landscape. So another great example is Barcelona in the Catalonia region of Spain. This dates from 1858 by Ildefonso Cerda, and it's known as the Eixample. This is actually pronounced Eixample versus example or anything like that. So if you're trying to pronounce it, and that translates from Catalan. It's not Spanish; it's Catalan. It translates into expansion. And so this Barcelona example was a little bit different than, say, Paris, which was taking an existing medieval dense city and slicing through with boulevards. Barcelona had an original medieval core, and in this historic map, we see that in dark down at the lower left corner. That's what's now known as the Gothic Quarter, and that is the original sort of medieval part of the city. But by the mid 19th century, it was clear that the city was going to be growing, and so Cerda's plan was to create essentially a grid network that the city could expand in ad infinitum, right? If you use a system of grids, it makes for a very efficient traffic layout and a very efficient, kind of ability for property surveyors and property transactions to have rectangular spaces rather than very awkward polygonal landscaped or property boundaries, and it would allow you know, you could expand the city as far as you wanted in that grid layout, as of course we know with Chicago. What he does also introduce, though, are a few diagonal streets. You can kind of see a few slicing through that provide kind of an ability to get from one corner of the city to the other. Because the one problem with a grid layout for a city as it gets bigger and bigger is if you want to go from, it's one thing if you want to go from north to south or east to west, you got a straight line and you don't have to make any turns. But if you want to go from, the south corner to the northeast corner, it would take you a lot longer to go to on the two legs of the triangle. So you create the hypotenuse of a triangle, and that allows someone to more quickly, transect from one corner of the city to the other. So he figures that out and introduces a few of those throughout his plan for Barcelona. So the old quarter of the city largely remains. Now, Cerda had planned for, you can see a few, boulevards that would slice through. Most of them actually weren't even implemented. The only one that was done is what's known as the Ramblas, which is this right in the center. It kind of goes at an angle from what will become a major plaza for the city to the harbor front down. This is the Mediterranean Sea down here at the bottom. Now, the unusual thing about the Eixample, though, it's a grid plan, but it is the corners are clipped. So rather than having pure squares or pure rectangles, he creates these little clipped corners. The black are, the sort of street grid, and then the sort of cream color are the building blocks. And the idea behind that was both a better transportation connection. If you have to turn the corner, you have a little bit more of a turning radius to do that. But it also opened up each corner to be a little more open space, right? You could put a monument in the center, you could put a little park or something in the center here, and that would provide maybe a little more light, a little more vista or view if you have a monument or a little park with trees or something growing in the center. Barcelona is one of the most unique cities in its layout because it has this city grid with all these clipped corners. So here's an aerial view of the Eixample. If you look at the far top, you can see the grid. This area, sort of the top left, is very random. That's the Gothic Quarter. That's the old medieval part of the city that grew up along the Mediterranean coastline that you see in the far top left corner. But we see this grid of the city as it's laid out, including some very, very wide major boulevards. And here you can see slicing from bottom left to upper right is one of those diagonal streets that slices across the corners of the city to provide, that cross connection there. And this is, if you can see my pointer right here near the upper left, this is the Plaza de Gracia. This is the major central plaza of Barcelona. There's a line, you can see the line that slices through the old Gothic Quarter. That's the Ramblas that I'll show you in a second here. So here's some view of the Gothic Quarter, and like the Latin Quarter we just showed you in Paris, this, very, very narrow streets, not a lot of light, not a lot of air and ventilation, and it was, beginning to be understood by this mid 19th century that the lack of light, the lack of natural ventilation and fresh air had a detriment to people's health. And so part of the idea was an improvement in public health by providing more ventilation, providing more natural light, and so forth. But you can again also see how crowded these streets would be if you also tried to have any kind of vehicle, whether it was a horse and buggy or whether it's a modern car on these narrow streets. Doesn't work, especially the one on the right. You can see just how narrow that is. But I'm taking these photos from the Ramblas. This is the grand boulevard that did get sliced through the Gothic Quarter, and you can see, like the boulevards in Paris, it's very wide. You can see traffic there on the left, but you have wide pedestrian walkway lined with trees, like the allées that we saw at Hyde Park, the walkway lined with trees. And nowadays, people set up their little market stalls. It's a really popular place. This is one of the most, if you visit Barcelona, this is where almost every tourist will walk up and down. They've got the street performers, and of course a lot of pickpockets, unfortunately, as you're watching the street performers. But you can, buy, souvenirs and things in some of the market stalls. And then the buildings are lined up along here that are, similar. It's a different architectural style, but similar to the way the buildings in Paris were done. And here's a nice aerial view. I took this from one of the towers of La Sagrada Familia, which we'll talk about later in a later lecture. But we can see, the grid, the straight street line here in the grid, and you can really make out the clipped corners of each block at each intersection there. Nowadays, unfortunately, the little clipped areas tend to be a parking zone. So it's I guess it's functional. It's probably not so ideal and romantic, but obviously people need a place to park vehicles and delivery trucks. And so it actually works very well from that standpoint, because you can still have a cross intersection and delivery trucks can get out of the way in the little triangle off the corner there. The other thing, these are very large blocks, and the plan idea was to have an open courtyard in the center of each block, and that you would be a square donut. And so here, this is a view from one side of the building block, and you can see essentially an open courtyard. And so everybody now has, instead of being backed up on another narrow alleyway with very little light or ventilation, everybody has this wide open courtyard in the center. You can have balconies, you can have light and fresh air. Some of them are fairly built over on the ground floor, but you could put, garden, rooftop gardens in there. Some of them could be more, of a park-like setting in the center there. So this was a pretty radical plan, a fundamental shift in city planning from very tight, narrow, dense quarters with no light, no ventilation, to something in which almost everyone, even poor people living in tenements, the working class, they all of a sudden have a similar view of open light and ventilation. They can have a balcony, they can have a little outdoor space, they could grow some plants, either for something pretty or to grow some potted herbs and stuff that they could use for cooking. Here is, this is the Passage de Gracia. This is one of the main boulevards, the very, very wide one that cuts through the city. And it's, similar to like the Champs-Élysées of Paris, very wide with a lot of streets, but you can see there's a walkway lined with trees on each side of the traffic lanes, and then there's actually yet another sort of parking lane. You can, park along here, and there's, a narrower drive for, accessing the parking. So it's a really efficient traffic system. And, at major intersections, you could have a fountain like you see down here. You could have, monuments and so forth. We're going to talk, speaking of Gaudí, here's another building. We'll talk later about the Casa Mila, but This is, built, in 1906, but this is on the Passeig de Gracia, but it has a clipped corner. Now, Gaudí, doesn't do it with a sharp angle. He, has this meandering, flowing architecture of the Art Nouveau, which we'll be talking about later, but you can see the clipped corner and how that works here. You can see the traffic here at the intersection, but the crowds of people that gather out to queue up to go into the museum at this building can gather in that triangle outside of the clipped corner. So let's talk a little bit about the planning in America, and we'll start with one of the most important ones, which is Central Park in New York City. This was planned in 1858 and was built over time, largely finished by 1873. It was designed by a team, Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. And Olmsted, this was really the first major project by Olmsted, and this put him on the map. He became one of the most preeminent landscape designers and planners of the 19th century. So we're gonna come back to Olmsted several times, both today, and he pops up in another lecture here coming after the spring break. And he and Vaux teamed up together to win a competition, essentially, to design this grand new park in the middle of Manhattan Island. And they didn't have a lot of formal training or anything. He was a naturalist. He liked plants and all that, and had an idea that came up that becomes influential for city planning, for landscape planning, for college campus planning, for many, many, many decades. One could argue that he's still immensely influential. So Central Park is literally near the center of Manhattan Island. And a little quick history, Manhattan really, or New York City, started down here at the lower part of Manhattan Island, what we call lower Manhattan. And as it grew, for much of its early history, well into the 19th century, northern Manhattan, way up in this area here, was still sort of open farmland. But the city was growing, and the city planners and city leaders could see that it was growing, and would probably keep doing so. And being on an island, they only had so much space, so it was becoming pretty clear that eventually the entire island would become developed and become an urban, landscape. And what had been open, farms and trees and landscape was going to disappear. And so, in a brief moment of New York City planning brilliance, they decided to set aside a large segment of the center of the island as a large public park so that it would not be developed ever. I say a brief moment because I don't think New York City is very well planned and developed, but I'll skip over some of that. And this is a massive park, 850 acres. It goes for several miles north to south. It's about half a mile or so wide. It takes a huge slice out of the city, which again is really fantastic given the property values of Manhattan. Certainly now that this much land and territory would be set aside. It's so big that they had to have a number of streets crossing it east to west, and you can see 65th, 79th, 85th, 97th Street, so that if you're on Central Park East and you want to go to Central Park West, you can easily get through there by street. So here's one of those aerial views that's just really famous. And it is pretty impressive to see both from the air. If you fly in or out of New York City, you get some great views of it, but, from one of the towers as well. And what's so amazing is that, again, the city completely did develop all the way to the north end of Manhattan Island, and with very, very tall skyscrapers largely, although they get smaller as you get to the north end, way off in the distance there. But that creates an impressive street wall, similar to the street wall along Michigan Avenue at Grant Park. But this goes on for miles and miles. So it is a pretty dramatic contrast between urban landscape or urban design, right, in city, and this more naturalistic landscape. So here's a nice plan view with the south end being over here on the right. And Olmsted and Vaugh created something very similar to the plan of Hyde Park, in which it is largely a naturalistic or picturesque planning meant to be that when you're in the park, you feel like you are in nature. So there's not a lot of straight lines and boulevards and, symmetrical, geometric garden plots like we were seeing in the Renaissance. It's meandering, it's flowing ponds and streams. It's this reservoir here in the center is a blob. There's a naturalistic lake over here on the left, but it does have a few alleys that slice through at angles. Here's one over here that slices from one end to one corner to another. There's a sort of rectangular reservoir in the center, but for the most part, even the cross streets, you can see a few of them here, even curve a little bit. They don't fully line up from one block to the other, or they make a bend, so that as you're driving across the park, you almost feel like you're immersed a little bit in this naturalist landscape. And it is I got to visit it a few years ago for the first time, and it is an impressive, you get in the middle of this park and you truly don't realize you're in the middle of one of the densest cities in the world. You can usually see glimpses of the high rises all around you, and there's still a little bit of the sort of urban buzz, that noise that's happening. But there are areas where you can wander into that make you feel like you're in the middle almost of nowhere. But this is one of the allays that is introduced. It's known as the Mall. So this is like we've talked about with the Hyde Park and some of the parks in France, in Paris, where you have a wide walking, back in the day one could have taken a carriage ride through here, and it's lined with benches and it's lined with trees. So this is absolutely a human intervention. It's straight, straight as an arrow, and you can walk along through here. It's lined with monuments and so forth. Yes, Jaman.
When was Grant Park built? In
Grant Park,
Chicago?
well, we're going to talk about the Chicago parks a little bit, so
I'll
I'll
wait.
get to that. Okay. So, um, but most of the rest of the park is more natural. This is known as the Green, which is kind of a thing that was in New England, in the center of any town square. They called it the Green, and there'd usually be sheep, grazing, and, people could take a picnic and so forth. This is on a grand scale in one of the grandest cities in America, right? So it's big, but you can see it's just a open space where people can lay out, sunbathe, throw a frisbee, read a book, just hang out. And it's big enough to handle, large crowds even on really nice days. And of course, you can see, there's the trees that meander around it. There's, boulders that make it look like it's a meadow, in a forest, and you don't totally fool because you see the high rises scattered around beyond that. Here's a historic view of the Green, and these are in fact the sheep that they would use to mow the grass. Before big lawnmowers, they would just had sheep out here, and you just had to make sure you knew where you were stepping before you laid out your blanket to have a little picnic. Here is one of the cross streets, and to prevent traffic that would be, crisscrossing, going from one side to the other and having, pedestrian accidents or pedestrians having to wait and traffic having to wait for crossing, people crossing, Olmsted and Vaux created these tunnels that go under the street so that people walking, riding bikes or whatever, they would not have to cross the traffic of the street. And so it makes the use of the park so much more pleasant because you can go from one end, the south end, all the way to the north end of Central Park and never have to, push a button, at the crosswalk and wait for traffic to stop for you or something like that. And it creates, this meandering effect that makes it much more pleasant to be in. Here is an area with a kind of a naturalistic landscape. There's these granite boulders lying around. This looks like, the landscape of Manhattan Island prior to the development of the city. And of course, you're developing the city, they just took bulldozers and they flattened everything out. What's ironic about this, most people don't realize this, is that all of this flowing landscape and these granite boulders, most of this were put in here and arranged by Olmsted and Vaux to their designs. It wasn't like, oh, there was a granite boulder here, we'll leave that and leave it exposed. Most cases, they're like, hey, let's put a boulder here, and they were actually creating a landscape that had once existed but had largely been removed by the farmers that wanted flat open land for their growing crops and so forth. So they were actually in many cases reintroducing the naturalistic landscape. And then this area is one of my favorites. This is called the Ramble, and this is a very rocky terrain. There's creeks, with little waterfalls. Every so often, there's a little stone bridge where somebody might be walking above you. But it is like walking through the middle of a New England rocky mountainside, and this is where you can really get the sense that you are in the middle of nowhere. And for a while in the high crime era of the 1980s, early 90s, this was an area of Central Park where you didn't want to walk at night for sure. Here is one of the central ponds, just like we saw with Hyde Park. It's this natural. It's just like this lake, but it's all created by Olmsted and Vaux. They dammed up a creek and created this lake that makes you feel like you're part of something that nature created, but is in fact man-made, just meant to look like a natural landscape. And it's a very popular place. People like to rent rowboats, and this is a famous. You see this in New York's based rom-com movies. You have to take a boat ride or meander hand in hand with your sweetheart in a view like this. Okay, so to answer Jomon's question, let's talk a little bit about Chicago's development of its park system. Chicago is really a major leader in city planning in the idea that they needed to have an extensive park system. Parks were generally not part of city planning. The cities just grew, and people bought land, they developed it for housing, for businesses, and all that. And the idea of having a lot of parks was not something that was typically done. And so a lot of cities that were already established often had to come back and clear out space in order to create parks. Hyde Park in London, Moda Bologne in Paris worked out for these parks because they were existing landscapes because they had been old hunting grounds. And New York City was smart enough to create that set aside for Central Park before the city had completely grown up around it. So in 1869, Chicago established a park system, and they hired Olmsted and Vaux to create a park plan for them. They had established their reputation based on the work they did for Central Park, and so they were hired by Chicago to design a park system for the city. Later, William LeBaron Jennings gets involved, and later an incredible prairie school landscape designer, Jens Jensen, also had a role as the parks developed and grew. So here's a map of the city, and of course, we have Lake Michigan. And to slightly answer Jomon's question, Chicago, when the city was established in its in its city charter, they put a set aside for the lakefront to be forever clear and free, or forever free and clear of development. And that provision has been enforced ever since. And that's why we have the incredible parks that line Lake Michigan, including Grant Park. You know, obviously it's named after Ulysses Grant, and for a long time, a lot of that was rail yards and so forth. If we're looking here, this is the loop right in here. You can almost just make out some of the rail lines that are in there, and a lot of it was actually Shoreline. After the Chicago fire and other things, they actually did a lot of fill to create Grant Park. But the idea of an open shoreline was a novel idea, because typically riverfronts and lakefronts in cities were heavily industrialized, and the concept of keeping the lakefront clear was a radical idea at the time. But that wasn't going to be enough. The city was growing west, it was growing northwest, southwest, all that. And, you know, the further you get away from the lakefront, the less, you know, you can't really enjoy it anymore. And so in 1869, the city planners said, hey, look, we need to have a series of parks that would be scattered and sort of ring the loop, so that as the city is growing, they would have access to it. So they were kind of taking the lead of New York, knowing that the city would continue to grow, and like, we need to set aside parkland for that to happen. But one of the things with Chicago's park system is that they thought, well, let's connect all of those parks. So rather than have one big giant park, New York did, let's have a series of smaller parks that would be more like neighborhood parks. And let's connect them with boulevards the way those Parisians are doing, those grand boulevards. And so Chicago takes these ideas that are happening in London and in Paris and in New York, and they put them all together and create what most people recognize as one of the most incredible park systems of any city in the world. And today we have some of the major parks: Jackson Park, Washington Park, Garfield Park, Douglas, and Humboldt. Those are the original parks that were laid out. Lincoln Park, that you know on the north side, that was an existing park that was already along the lakefront, so that was incorporated into the system that they were developing, but it wasn't one of the new park systems that they had created. So here we see down here in the lower left corner, that's Jackson Park. That's down here. We've got Washington Park a little bit west of that. That's right in this area. This is, here's Garfield Park on the sort of center left. Douglas Park is down below that, and Humboldt Park is right up in this area. And it's a little hard to tell probably in this map, but you can see that some of them are connected with these green slices that link to them. And that's the boulevard system that was created. So let me kind of show you more what I'm talking about. So here's an aerial view of Jackson Park. And again, we've got the shoreline, which was left open, free and clear per the city charter, but Jackson Park stretches in, cuts into the space here. And of course, that's where we have the Museum of Science and Industry now. The Obama Center is going to be going right in this area over here. And shortly we'll talk about what it was also famous for, the site of the Columbian Exposition. It was planned in 1869. Not a whole lot was done until after the Columbian Exposition, which took up almost the entire park site. And then after that was dismantled in 1894, they built the modern park as we have it today. But I also want to point out this green space that slices off to the left of Jackson Park. That's the Midway Plaisance. That also had something to do with the Columbian Exposition. I'll talk about that later. But that represents one of the grand boulevards as well that were established. So here's a view of Jackson Park as it was developed after 1894. It has that sort of naturalistic landscape. There's a beautiful little pond in the center with, picturesque bridges that cross it, boulders and rocks, and of course a view of the Museum of Science and Industry. Here is Garfield Park. This was largely planned and implemented by William Jenney and Jens Jensen. Again, the park was established, starting in 1869. Some things were done, but a lot of it was not developed until the 1870s under Jenney, and then later in the early 1900s under the Prairie School landscape planner Jens Jensen. And we see a very naturalistic landscape. This is especially influenced by Jens Jensen, who wanted to introduce the naturalistic Illinois prairie into these parks in Chicago. Here is Humboldt Park, also again laid out largely by William Jenney and then later developed by Jens Jensen. This is the Boathouse here, so we have a Prairie School boathouse that we'll be talking about later. And so this, you could rent boats and then take them out for little, rowboat excursions on one of the ponds in Humboldt Park. This is also Humboldt Park, also one of the sort of natural prairie landscapes that Jens Jensen established. Off in the distance is the receptory building. This is where the park system kept all the horses and wagons and stuff to help maintain the park system back when they had to do that with horses and buggies. I actually worked on the restoration of that building back in the late 90s. And then this is a postcard view, an historic postcard view of Humboldt Boulevard. So this was one of the grand boulevards that linked the major parks. And this is modeled after those grand boulevards in Paris under Baron Haussman. It has, driving lanes that you see. It has a center parkway that has trees and grass. And then it has on the side, it has a wide sidewalk and what is known as a parkway here, where you got more trees and grass. And so the idea on these grand boulevards is that they provide a direct straight line connection between these major parks, but it's sort of like extending the parks through the neighborhoods, right? You get more trees and greenery and landscape that stretch between and help people, if you want to go from park to park, or more likely, if you live in a neighborhood and you want to go to the park, you work your way to one of the boulevards, and then you have a very pleasant stroll or horse ride or buggy ride to get to the park. Here's another view. This is in Logan Square, and these became really valuable property, sites. And so in many cases, you saw grand homes that were built along here. Later in the 20th century, probably big apartment blocks, because people wanted to live along these boulevards. They had a view out their front window of, greenery and trees, and they weren't, 20 feet or 60 feet away from the next building that was, 100 feet or more between, the neighbor out the front view. So it was very much a almost a suburban-like place to live. Do you have another question, Jaman? No? Okay. All right, so another major planning development, also by Olmsted and Ball, happens in Riverside. How many people have gotten lost in Riverside before? If you've ever tried to drive there, anyone do that?
I get lost in Chicago in general.
Yeah. It's not as bad now that most cars have like a GPS system or you can pull it up on your phone. But, back in the day when you, at best you had a paper map, this was a challenging place, to try to drive to. But this was
signal lost.
Yeah.
Under the bridges in Chicago.
Yeah, so this was a planned suburb in 1869, and it was actually developed by a corporation that bought the land, scenic land along the Des Plaines River, and their plan was to sell off lots, make a lot of money as basically a developer, suburban developer, to homeowners that would want a more suburban life. They'd want to get out of the city. you could live along one of the boulevards, but there weren't that many of them. You know, most of the city was still pretty crowded and dense and dirty. You know, this was in an era before clean air, you know, EPA regulations, and so there was a lot of pollution. So you know, people wanted to, if you could afford to, they wanted to get out of the city and live in a more picturesque, naturalistic landscape with broad green lawns and trees. Same reason why people live in the suburbs today, even. And with the advent of the railroad, one of those industrial revolution things we talked about, which is this straight line that slices diagonally through the plan of Riverside, that's the railroad. You can hop on the train in the morning, go into work to work during the day in the city, and then take the train back out in the evening. And people still do today. You hop on the Metro. And so it became, you know, ironically, the Industrial Revolution allows for people to escape the city and live in a sort of naturalistic landscape that has nothing to do, try to escape from this modern, you know, industrial landscape. And it's all possible because of the railroad. And so Olmsted and Vaugh, who were hired by the developers, said, hey, you know, let's embrace that. Let's not create a grid of streets like Oak Park or Berwyn, Cicero, which were developing at the same time. Let's create this picturesque landscape that reflects the meandering Des Plaines River. It has this big oxbow here in the river at Riverside. And, you know, we'll line that with parks, and then we'll have these meandering streets that allow people to feel like they're living in nature. It was a radical idea. This is the first time we see a suburban development that is in America that isn't really based on the system, and isn't because they have to, you know, go around mountains or hills or something like that. It's, you know, a flat landscape, and this was purposely planned to be, you know, meandering like this. So at the center would be a little town center. This is right here along the railroad tracks. This is the water tower that William LeBaron Jenney designs. There was some support buildings for that. The water tower still exists. There it is today. It's been nicely restored and painted. And there's a few commercial buildings around the train station, which makes sense. You know, that's where the commuters are coming and going, both in the morning and the afternoon. And so if you're going to pick up, you know, groceries or your laundry or something like that, it's convenient for the commuters to do that. And so you create a little town square around the railroad depot. But the rest of Riverside is largely suburban development, or residential development, I mean. And here's a nice view of, you know, what we're talking about, right? Especially if you haven't, you know, taken a drive through Riverside. There are no straight streets, you know, everything curves and meanders just like it would in nature. And it's lined with trees, and it's, you know, there's a lot of parks and open parkland. And so the residents felt like they were living in one of these naturalistic landscapes. And then, of course, these are some of the houses. This is, anybody know what style house this is? A little pop quiz, since we'll be, you know, you'll be quizzed on it on Tuesday.
Victorian?
Anyone?
Yeah.
Well, it's Victorian era, but one of the styles we talked about in
Gothic
our lecture
era?
on 19th century style. Gothic, yes, it's a Carpenter Gothic, to be very specific. But yeah, Gothic revival. We got the pointed windows. We got almost sort of arched, you know, sort of pointed arches in the railings here. We got the vertical board and batten siding that was common, some decorative verge board or barge board in the gables. So all of those are indicative of Carpenter Gothic. This is one of the oldest houses in Riverside from the early 1870s, designed by William LeBaron Jenney, which is ironic because we're going to talk about Jenney a little later. He was an important figure in the early Chicago school architecture. Not at all like this Carpenter Gothic. Here's another early house. This was built in 1871. This was the George Gilbert house. It was a Italianate style house, a style we didn't talk about, but these tall windows with these, you know, decorative features around them. make this Italianate. And notice the name, Gilbert. George Gilbert was my great-great-great-grandfather. He was one of the first residents of Riverside, ironically. Here's a view of that house in the 1890s. This is after George died in the 1870s, sadly, and so the family left the house. So this is not, that's not one of my ancestors, the little girl there, but it shows you the house as it looked. It had some renovations, unfortunately, and fire in the 1930s, but it's still there. And then Riverside's also famous, and we'll talk a little later, for things like Frank Lloyd Wright did several houses. This is the Avery Coonley House from 1908 by Frank Lloyd Wright. So just a little peek ahead at the Prairie School lecture we'll be giving here in a few weeks. All right, so that covers 19th century planning.